Right.
Right.
Hello and welcome to the Performance Proposition at last.
Yes. This hasn't taken us 20 minutes to get to this point.
I mean, in all fairness, it's only taken us 4.5 minutes.
Oh, fair.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not too bad.
That's not too bad. Not too bad. New system, new setup, everything.
Yeah, I mean, just broken
everything
phone.
takes time. That really doesn't help.
It really doesn't help. And it's very frustrating because the Samsung store doesn't have any engineers.
That's your fault for getting a Samsung.
Ouch. Ouch.
I mean, you do technically just need to get a new phone. Matt's phone is from the 80s.
I'm still within contract, for goodness sake. I'm on a 2-year
How long
contract.
was your contract?
2 years.
I don't believe it. Don't believe it for a second.
It's an S22. It's not that old.
All right. Fine. So we are trying something new today.
Yes.
In that we have actually both read a research study, and we're going to discuss the findings of said research study and the implications of the research study, and see, if we can bring any value from that. But first off, Matt needs to tell me something funny.
Well, I was going to say, I was reading the research study, but I also I'm reading a lot of Greek mythology at the moment. Struggling to understand it. It's always been my Achilles elbow.
Excellent. That, do you know what? That was good.
But
It's been a while.
It has been a while. I had some good ones this week, to be fair. I got quite a few. I don't know if Instagram just picked up on the fact that I hadn't done a joke on here in a while and was just throwing dad jokes at me left, right and centre.
I feel like
that would be the
the
easiest
tech
one
guys
to
are
land.
feeling like they need to do a really good job at the moment with how much of a bad rep they're getting on the world stage. So I'm pleased that they are bringing you joy, and in turn bringing me joy.
Yeah. So am I.
So do you want to start with your study, or do you want to start let's start with your study? I feel like
Okay.
it's a good place to begin.
So, I had to think about sort of what was going to be the most relevant to people listening to this podcast. So I thought I'd start with something in endurance sports because, the vogue thing at the moment is kind of... I don't really know what you would term endurance sports other than long-distance running, and I don't know if High Rocks counts. I don't know if CrossFit counts as an endurance sport. But either way, It was an umbrella review of... I think it ended up being 22 endurance sports. So not endurance sports, 22 different studies. And the studies they reviewed were reviews. So it got all of that. So it's a review of a review. I know. Nice. We're getting to meta levels of data and things, but I suppose it's the highest form of evidence, right? You've got loads of people that have done a review. These guys have quantified the quality of the different reviews, and they left one out because it was of very poor quality, and the rest of them they sort of ranked them and they showed you the quality that they thought the reviews were, and they basically just pulled all the data and looked at the best ways to recover and whether or not there was any actual evidence that any of the recovery strategies worked. So the ones they looked at were compression garments, what's that? Temperature-based studies, so things like hot cold therapy, supplements, massage, and active recovery. So most of it was passive recovery, and active recovery I think is they just termed it as any sort of movement to recover. And the results are as expected, as we discussed earlier, that there's a lot of data to suggest that a lot of these recovery strategies improve perception of recovery. But there's not a lot of data to show that anything really happens on a physiological level, other than the two that suggest there were physiological changes, temperature-based stuff and active recovery, and to an extent compression garments. But there were a lot of studies looking at it, and 2 out of the 20 odd studies, 30 odd studies even, that were talking about it basically showed nothing.
No benefit.
So
no benefit.
2 out of 30 is not a big
good
number.
odds.
Not good odds. Whereas the the temperature-based therapy is what, 3 out of 9. So again, not great.
33%.
But 33%, and then the active recovery is 2 out of 5. So roughly, I guess, about the same. And then basically none of them, other than there was one study, 2 studies even, in compression garments that showed an actual positive impact on performance. One study in compression garments actually showed a negative impact on performance, which is interesting. But we always get results like that when we look at a lot of different studies.
What was the kind of rationale given? Was there any kind of, did they go into the detail of why certain things might work and why we might be seeing an invalidation of those outcomes, or like they might not be as effective as people might have originally thought?
I think there was a methodological sort of quirk, if you like, in the one that showed a negative effect, in that I think they were wearing them during exercise as opposed to post-exercise.
Nice.
So they found there was like a lower amount of like lactate in the legs of those who wore it during, which is sort of what you'd, I don't know if it's what you'd expect, but basically there was something like that. I can't remember exactly, but they did say that there was a little methodological
the reason
quirk.
would be that there'd be like an increase in venous return, and as a result you'd end up with less lactate, so you'd get better washout. Okay, that is relatively interesting.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they said it was better washout and not better delivery of oxygen to the muscle while it was working.
I can't exactly remember unless I find my way into it now. There you go. Negative impact of CG on time to exertion in a maximal treadmill test. Beneficial effect of using CG on a lactate concentration 1 minute after exercise.
Okay, so
positive.
when it says there was a negative impact of CG on time to fatigue, is that saying that it took longer for them to get to fatigue, or
shorter.
That it took less? So they had a negative outcome in terms of performance, and therefore, but like a lower lactate figure post workout. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
so
this is the thing with so many recovery studies, right? Is it's so hard to, measure performance, because you've got to fatigue people, then you've got to try a recovery strategy, then you've got to double blind it somehow, which you can't really do.
No.
And then you've got to test them, but then then how long do you leave between tests if you're gonna do fatigue performance test, then double cross it so that then you're doing fatigue performance test without the recovery strategy, and is there a training effect involved across that time? And there's all this sorts of stuff. So a lot of them tend to focus on the physiological changes and whether or not there are any, and most of them seem to find that there aren't really physiological changes for a lot of the recovery things, but your perception of recovery, your perception of soreness mostly, which is what I guess most people term as recovery, perception of how sore am I, how able do I feel to do things, is usually a little bit lower. The issue potentially comes when people are perceiving themselves as more recovered, doing more work, creating
and as a
more
result,
damage,
creating overtraining and overreaching a little bit more.
Exactly, overtraining and overreaching. Like, I mean, speaking from experience, when I was at like Scotland and Wales Sevens, we'd go to tournaments, we'd use things like ice baths on tournament weekends, i.e. in between games. So they'd get off the pitch, they'd get straight in the ice bath, get out, put the compression garments on, do basically everything, tick all of the recovery boxes, so that they would feel less sore for the next game, so they could keep putting maximal effort into the games.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't utilise that during training camps, so like build up to tournaments, because like the reason that we'd use them is to allow them to keep exerting performance in that level, not to have them recover faster, if that makes sense. It's just kind of,
so it's not to allow yourself to increase the training dose to a greater extent. It's just to allow them to perform better within match play and within tournament play. So exactly. If you've got like two matches in the space of 3-4 days, You need to feel like you're able to perform at your best in each scenario. So what we're really saying is that the fundamentals of, well, the fundamental outcome of the study is there's no real evidence that any kind of recovery strategy really works that well.
Yeah.
Unless your goal is to try to
feel a bit better,
improve performance for subsequent competitive bouts. Yeah. So it's less relevant to like day-to-day training and more relevant to competitive match play, and like if you're in a tournament and you've got things like that going on. So it's kind of similar to the outcomes around like the anabolic window a little bit, in the sense of there's no real evidence that the anabolic window's that beneficial to in most cases, but if you have multiple things in quick succession, if you've got multiple competitions over the course of 2-3 days, you want to utilise anabolic window to the extent that you can to replenish glucose supplies and stuff. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's
and I think the highlight point is like you can do all the fancy stuff, but the main thing that's going to make sure you're recovered is sleeping well, fueling efficiently, and possibly just managing stress and other things in your life.
Saying biohacks aren't necessarily the answer.
I'd never say that.
So I shouldn't buy myself a MyoMaster chill.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I've put the compression, like, you know, the big ones that like push air down your legs. They feel great. I mean, you step out of them, you feel light. You're like
that glorious sensation of just having received a massage from a robot.
Whoa. Let's not make this weird. All right.
I mean, that's the future. That is the future. Okay, well, cool.
What was your study?
So my study was looking. It's a review article as well. It was kind of looking into training load and equating training load across high intensity and low intensity modalities. Mm-hmm. So, like within endurance training again. So it's looking at basically like how do you, from both a study perspective, understand the training dose that you're applying to an individual if you're doing high intensity training and low, if you've got like a high intensity and low intensity condition that you're trying to study, how do you make sure the workload's equated across both?
Right.
But also when it comes to day-to-day life and athlete development, how do you equate work? So say you've got an athlete who's been doing 3 1-hour zone 2 sessions and you're trying to move up that intensity spectrum. How do you kind of equate the work across those two different conditions? So how do you make sure that your training dose remains consistent as you increase the intensity, or progresses to the extent that you want it to progress while you're changing the intensity that you're applying to them? Fundamentally, it was a bit of a weird study. There's like quite a lot to it.
I was going to say, what was the criticism? Because you said there was a criticism and then there was a response. And I'm interested to know. I haven't
read either of those two articles yet because of the fact I wanted to go back and read this. So basically, I've just subscribed to the IJSPP, so the International Journal of Sport Physiology and Performance, which is one of the human kinetical ones. The thing is, I think that like from a sports science perspective, right? Like when we look at like kind of coaching studies and we look at strength and conditioning studies and we look at all these things, like fundamentally what we need to be able to understand, what the foundation of all of this stuff is, it comes down to understanding biomechanics, understanding physiology, understanding metabolism and biochemistry, because those are the things that we're really trying to assess the changes in markers, like biochemical markers, that then affects physiological processes, and potentially a little bit of an understanding of biomechanics, so you can understand how you can change movements or how you can adjust exercises to particularly target certain things. Like those kind of foundational kind of sciences are the key for us to research. So yeah, the IJSPP is one of the journals that I've been wanting to subscribe to for a little while, because it's it's the thing that I find interesting, and this particular topic is like obviously one of the ones that I'm really invested in, because understanding kind of training load and understanding trying to figure out one of the things that I was trying to do for ages was figure out how to equate training load not just across different intensities within endurance training, but also across different intensities across different modalities. So like resistance training compares to sprint training and plyometric training, and how you can kind of try to equate all of those things.
That would be useful.
I mean, it would be amazing.
That would be useful.
It's kind of, based on this study, it looks like it's probably not possible, I'll be completely honest, because this is looking at endurance outcomes, and it was saying that, so what the finding it had was that in certain cases, in using certain types of measures, the like average, I'll open it up here so that I can actually read the numbers to you, because it was just nuts. But like, this is just from the abstract. Oh, hello. So yeah, in certain scenarios, the ratio of work was, so if you look at high intensity to low intensity ratio, the ratio of work was 1 to 1.5, maybe 1 to 10.
Yeah.
And then in other scenarios, it was like up to 1 to 100. So dependent on what metric you're using, like how those things equate is just gonna vary absolutely wildly.
1 to 100.
1 to 100, yeah. It was, but it's kind of. I'll go into detail a little bit now, but like basically, like if you, so there were 10 methods that they kind of looked at within their review, and they divided those into kind of 4 categories. So you had your arbitrary methods, which are things like trim scores, etc. Where you've got a defined intensity value, so like 50 to 60% heart rate max, 60 to 70% heart rate max, 70 to 80% heart rate max. It doesn't necessarily really relate to anything, it's just an arbitrarily selected figure. But you can kind of categorize work based on which of those intensity zones it's placed into, and then multiply it by a trim score to then show there's an exponential increase in load associated with that increase in training intensity.
Right.
They had physiological and perceptual measurements, so the amount of work that was actually done, so like basically just energy expenditure across different modalities. So if you were doing 1 hour of really low intensity steady state work at 50% of heart rate max versus doing the same amount of total energy expenditure but in 4-minute intervals, like equating those two and trying to find a way of equating those two, or the banister trim model. Then you had like the post-exercise measurements in terms of excess post-exercise oxygen consumption and loss of performance and drops of performance. And then the final section was kind of a comparison to kind of maximal dose. So the comparison to maximum dose, either acutely or chronically. So if you think about an acute version, you'd be looking at, okay, if you can run at this intensity for 5 minutes, running at this intensity for 2.5 minutes is you working to 50% of the maximum dose. Whereas if you can run at this intensity for an hour, running for that intensity for 30 minutes is... And that's the kind of scenario where you were getting the really, really high like variability, because say for instance you chose an intensity whereby the individual could just carry on doing it indefinitely, they could just do it for 24 hours. You doing it for 1 hour and then trying to equate that to the markers in terms of like excess post-exercise oxygen consumption and stuff are just going to be so small from doing an hour of exercise at an intensity you could do for 24 hours versus like if I was doing something that was 24, that I could only really hold for 24 minutes or 24 seconds, but doing it for like 1 second, 1 minute, whatever. Like the outcome's going to be quite different, because the further you move up that intensity spectrum, the more bigger the impact is going to be in terms of physiological fatigue. Yeah.
What would you say is your main take home overall, one sentence from that study?
My main take home overall is that it's really, 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 really hard to compare between different measures and between different intensities, and trying to equate the things is difficult because of the fact that different types of training are going to affect different physiological systems. And it's just trying to find a way to understand the impact on each physiological system is probably going to be more important than trying to like find a way to match
Yeah, to match them or look at them
across,
together.
yeah. So like if you were to go, okay, right, if we go back to the example of comparing strength training, plyometric training, speed training, endurance training, you kind of need to understand the impact those things are going to have on muscle damage, on metabolic strain, etc.
You almost need to look at them like little dials, right? Like they're all separate, and to an extent they'll all have an impact on like the central thing, but it just, I guess, it becomes one of those where with so many of these things it's just about how a person responds as well so much, right? Because you do have certain people who will be super impacted by high intensity training, and some people who won't be impacted at all, like they'll just be able to just keep going, or like not impacted at all but impacted to a way less extent, but then will be super impacted by, say, lots of zone 2 in a way that the other person who's impacted by high intensity won't be impacted by zone 2. So like it just comes down to, like you say, trying to find a good way to measure each type of training, measuring it separately and tracking how that impacts the individual, then looking at the recovery strategies that make that individual feel better or perform better, and
jumbling it all up, putting it all out into a nice little training program.
Exactly.
I think that was one of the things that you just kind of made a reference to there. So the whole thing around different people having different outcomes, it's like that's an important thing for us to think about. But it's also like it kind of brings us to the point around training exposure as well. So studies looking at examples of people being exposed to a training program, but it's not really understanding like that person's prior exposure to a training program and how that impacts their degree of fatigue post session, right? So
100%.
If you're used to running for an hour, like on a regular basis, chances are the fatigue that you're going to experience the next day from having run for an hour is going to be pretty negligible. Whereas if you never really go out running for that sort of duration, the next day you're going to wake up, you're going to be in pain, your calves are going to be sore, your ability to perform is going to be severely hampered because of the fact that so it was a bit of a frustrating read, to be honest, because the fact I kind of had so much hope that it was going to go into some really, really interesting, and it was actually going to come out with a finding that I was like, oh yeah, that's great, that's actually really useful, and then we can extrapolate that out and we can think about how we could apply that on a broader scale. And instead it's just gone, like, no, we just can't really figure this out. That. It's
not today.
Yeah, but you know, fair. It's cool, and it's important that people are kind of like looking into it because of the fact it's foundational, right? When you actually think about what a training plan is and what the most important thing about training is, regardless of the system, it's all about progressive overload. Yeah. Right, and in order to understand progressive overload, you need to understand load, and you need to understand how load equates across different training modalities. Because if you don't understand those two things, then you can't think about how to progress. I mean, you can go, okay, right, well, today I lifted 50 kilos for 5 reps, tomorrow I'll lift 52.5 kilos for 5 reps. That's progression. But once you start getting into the intricacies of like creating a plan that varies slightly from block to block.
Cool. Yeah.
And exactly. Understanding loads just a bit more interesting and a bit more important.
Yeah. So I was going to suggest that we move on to the what has angered Xab and Matt this week on Instagram. So I actually have a couple of really good videos. Not to mention the one that I sent you about the fact that we should measure calories as a measure of heat. We won't even talk about that.
We can talk about that as well. That was entertaining.
Well, basically, I need to be off at 1:30. So what I was going to suggest we do is just summarise basically our findings from that, just for people, just kind of take home points if they got a bit lost in the science and us chatting above maybe where their head is at. So just a couple of take home points, and we'll leave it there. And then next week we'll get into a proper one. I want to create some jingles. Like for the different sections, do you know what I mean? Like I want to have like the nerdy section, this bit, and then like what's angered us on Instagram, and then maybe even have like a jingle for the joke. Like that would be fun.
Nice.
But yeah. Anyway, so
I'm excited to hear your jingles.
I might not even do them. I might outsource them to a friend.
Nice.
He's very good at that sort of stuff. But yeah, no, basically, I guess highlights for today, dear listeners, is that recovery is great. Make sure you've got your nutrition and your sleep on point before you start worrying about massage and ice exposure and compression garments and other things like that. However, if you engage in those strategies and it makes you feel good, then that's a step along the way to making you more recovered, because it's probably going to be managing your stress levels, because you're not going to be worried about the fact that you're sore and can you train and things like that. So just be aware that they don't have a massive impact. They are the 1%ers. Make sure your nutrition's on point, you're fueling effectively, and you're sleeping enough, and then do whatever you want with that stuff, but just be aware that it's probably only a 1%er.
Nice.
Go.
And when it comes to equating training load, we can't do it.
Cool. There you go. What a summary.
No, when it comes to equating training load, try to understand what systems you're loading and understand the impact of each training modality on that system and which metrics you actually think are the most useful for you to monitor, right? So if you are trying to improve lactate threshold, monitoring lactate levels in your blood is probably a useful thing for you to do. If you're trying to monitor muscle damage, then understanding, like monitoring creatine kinase in your blood is probably a useful thing to do, or muscle soreness is a useful thing to do. If you're looking to improve aerobic outcomes, then it's probably useful to understand what the aerobic stimulus is, and then in that sort of scenario, TRIMPs and RPEs might be useful ways of monitoring that. So deciding what work zone you're working in, and then utilising one of the models to basically say this is the workload that I've applied is probably the way to go. But it's just it's currently too difficult for us to find ways to equate between all of those different systems, different physiological pathways.
There you go.
But yeah.
Hope you enjoyed the extra. Yeah, that was a quick summary. It was a typical Xab quick summary.
I feel like I did all right.
I felt you did all right.
When you see the 4 pages of notes I've actually taken down right here, I feel like I did a pretty good job of summarising this study.
Fair. I'll give it to you. Well, I hope the audience enjoyed the slightly nerdier, different thing today. We'll try and put together a more complete podcast next week when we don't have technical issues at the start and phones that don't work, and I don't have to be gone early. Yeah. So,
or we don't start late because it was a combination of both. But yeah, thank you very much, Matt. It's good to see you.
No worries. See you next week.
Take care, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Don't leave.